welcome to this first Monday meeting of the Public Diplomacy Association and Public Diplomacy Council. And I'm Nick Cull from University of Southern California. And this morning's session is called Canada's Public Diplomacy. I am very glad to welcome my panel from Canada, and I'll introduce them in a moment. Just wanted to check, does anybody from the council or association want to say anything before we kick off? Nope. Okay. So the panel today really arises from this book, Canada's Public Diplomacy, which was published a little earlier this year. And the book in turn comes out of papers that were presented at USC 5 years ago now by a set of distinguished Canadian scholars, all of whom had been recipients of the US Canada Fulbright chair, which brings you to USC to research and teach. And as the USC end of the chair, I co-edited the book with my friend and collaborator, Michael Hawes. And the running order today is that Michael will speak first. He is the CEO of the US Canada Fulbright Commission and a professor of international relations at Queen's University in Canada. Michael will be followed by Sarah E.K. Smith, who is Assistant Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. And her present work includes work with the North American Cultural Diplomacy Initiative, which is an initiative to stimulate dialogue around cultural diplomacy between US, Canada, and Mexico, and to look for more bottom-up mechanisms of cultural diplomacy. And our third panelist is Mark Kristmanson, and Mark is a scholar, producer, and administrator, but his contribution here really comes from his time from 2014 through 19, when he was the CEO of the National Capital Commission in Ottawa, directing public programs and national events in that city. And so to get things rolling, what I'd like to do is to invite Mark, Sarah, and starting with Michael, in turn, to present something of their view of Canadian public diplomacy, kind of summarizing the approach in their particular chapter. And then we will move into, I think, a discussion of how Canada moves forward, and from there to questions from the floor. So, Michael, why don't you start the camera moving, unmute, and give us an idea about your chapter.
Thank you for that introduction, Nick. Hello, everyone. I am actually not speaking to you from Canada this morning, but rather from Huntington Beach, not far from USC in Los Angeles. My chapter was designed to address the question of whether the Trudeau government, and Mr. Trudeau in particular, lived up to his claim that our constructive commitment to internationalism, to public diplomacy, and to a more active role in the world was in fact realized. I start and since I'm the big picture person here on this panel, let me just take the first minute to say that what I did in this chapter is try to situate our public diplomacy initiatives in the context of our larger post-war reality. We were, as I think most people know, a large player in the reconstruction of the post-war world. We made a big commitment to internationalism and to international organization early on. As one of our former foreign ministers, Lloyd Axworthy, was fond of saying, show me an international organization and I'll join it. There was the sense that there were three pillars to Canadian foreign policy: peace and security, obviously, one pillar, productivity, economic security and trade, another pillar, and public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy, the third. It was, though, more muted than other places, and in particular the United States. There was a big commitment early on to peacekeeping. Mr. Axworthy had a major initiative on the landmines front, but there was no big organization like the US Information Agency, no unit within the government that was devoted entirely to public diplomacy, no big scholarship and exchange program like Fulbright, but rather a fairly Canadian middle ground position where we focused on big and important things and where we had a series of more modest programs that quietly but systematically supported Canadian studies around the world. The Canadian government had a program called Understanding Canada. The focus was on setting up study centers, providing modest funds to scholars, supporting Canadian culture wherever it was possible. Every embassy and consulate had what was called an academic relations officer. And through that, we sort of moved slowly but steadily through our public diplomacy strategy. With the end of the Cold War, the election of Mr. Harper and the appointment of Mr. Baird eventually as his foreign minister, that program was completely cut, with the single exception of their commitment to Fulbright. The switch was to something that the Canadian government called Imagine Canada, which was about putting foreign students in seats at Canadian universities and not about sharing our views and our values with the rest of the world. What happened then, as I said earlier, in 2015, Mr. Trudeau was elected and immediately declared that we should all take heart because our commitment to constructive internationalism would be renewed. And as he so famously now said, Canada is back. The truth is, though, his record has been mixed. Not long after Mr. Trudeau took office, there was an election in the United States. One of the features of that administration was to call into question the value and utility of the North American Free Trade Agreement. And while the Canadian government and Canadian journalists attempted to downplay that, it was, in my view, an existential threat. Living and working in Ottawa during that period, it was clear to me that the bulk of energy, emotional, physical, and financial, was devoted to resolving or reinventing NAFTA. That took the better part of that administration. Mr. Trudeau's big commitments to internationalism, to women and girls, and to Indigenous issues. I won't say they were on the back burner, but they were eclipsed by the need to do something about NAFTA. When Mr. Trudeau was re-elected in 2019, there were again big promises with respect to women and girls, Indigenous issues, public diplomacy, and Canada's role in the world. And during the whole period, Mr. Trudeau and his government participated in and attended all major international meetings. We were active in international organizations, but to be honest, nobody really in the Canadian government embraced public diplomacy as their own initiative. Minister Freeland focused on renegotiating NAFTA, the USMCA, which still strikes me as a confusing acronym. I keep thinking of the Village People and or the United States Marine Corps. We then, she moved out, Mr. Champagne moved in, that looked promising. He wasn't there long enough to embrace much. And now we have Mr. Garneau, who again, decent foreign minister, he has not really addressed or embraced public diplomacy either. There's no, although we do have a new international education strategy, which involves both in and out in a more fulsome and sophisticated way, we really haven't seen a dramatic increase in our commitment to or support for or interest in public diplomacy. I'll end by just suggesting that we have a couple of major public diplomacy or public relations issues right now, most notably the discovery or official discovery of 215 dead Indigenous children in Kamloops, and then a second using ground-piercing radar, a second discovery just outside Saskatoon as in the area of the Saulteaux people, the Cree nation in Saskatchewan. Not much has come out of that now. And I think the next thing that that we need to sort of pay attention to really is what public diplomacy might look like, given the fact that the world is changing, as a journalist once told me, more quickly than you academic guys have time to schedule seminars to discuss it. I'm going to leave it at that and happy to discuss current challenges.
Thank you, Michael. Let's go now to Sarah. And here, I think, a perspective more from cultural diplomacy emphasis.
Well, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Michael. It's really wonderful to be here and have the chance to celebrate this book. And as you noted, my connection or contribution to the book focuses on the visual arts and cultural diplomacy. And so my chapter is all about 49th Parallel, which is a really interesting case study that takes place before the era that Michael was just talking about. So I want to take us into the 80s and early 90s. So under the direction of Trudeau Sr. and then later Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister. So 49th Parallel was a special pilot project of the Department of External Affairs, now Global Affairs Canada. And the pilot project was to establish a center for Canadian contemporary art in the heart of New York City between 1981 and 1992. So I want to tell you just in a few minutes, just a bit about what 49th Parallel did, what it aimed to be. And I also want to hint at some lessons that I think 49th Parallel can teach us about cultural diplomacy, or put another way, why I think we should be talking about 49th Parallel now in this very different moment. So 49th Parallel was conceived by Guy Plamondon, who was an external affairs employee. And he pitched an idea for a Canadian art space in New York City to external affairs in 1978. And what he really wanted to do was to take advantage of the prominent New York art scene for contemporary art and provide Canadian artists with a kind of an entry point into that art scene and that art market. And so it was in 1981 that his vision was realized with the establishment of 49th Parallel. And I think it's really important to note that 49th Parallel was located in Soho, so right in the heart of New York's art scene. It had a very prominent location amongst many other prominent, well-established private galleries. And here's a picture, so you can see what it was looking like in 1981. There's two really important aspects of 49th Parallel that I think set it apart. So first, the 49th Parallel was a unique direction for external affairs. It was a new way of promoting Canadian visual art. So previously, external affairs had focused on promoting arts within its cultural centers. And so these cultural centers were often attached to embassies or consulates, and they often promoted artwork that was more historic or more traditional. But 49th Parallel was different in that it was highlighting experimental and contemporary art. So art that was recently produced, art that was for sale, art that didn't fit neatly into any boxes. 49th Parallel also stood apart from External Affairs' funding of specific museum exhibitions. And again, the shows that tended to receive funding tended to be more representative Canadian historical art or more genres like landscape painting, which were kind of more traditionally identified as nationalistic. So again, this is where 49th Parallel sought to innovate by really prominently underscoring the importance of experimental contemporary art. The other important thing to know about 49th Parallel is that it had a very ambiguous relationship to the state. And this is part of what intrigued me and what made me want to look into it further. So, of course, it was funded by External Affairs. It was an External Affairs project from the beginning, but it tried to shy away from really overt signs of nationalism. So you might not have seen flags at 49th Parallel. And in fact, the name 49th Parallel was specifically selected to be more of a low-key reference to the border between Canada and the United States, rather than something that might have kind of had more of a traditional tone, emphasizing the ties between Canada and this gallery. So in terms of my research into 49th Parallel, I was able to look at its history over 11 years and see really three different approaches that were taken by the gallery. So in the first period of the center's existence, the gallery was run and directed by External Affairs. And what I find was kind of shocked to find out in terms of my research is that Guy Palgrave, working with another External Affairs employee, Robert Hanforth, they were running the gallery at the same time that they were completing their daily jobs at the consulate in New York. So they were kind of doing double duty, which is obviously an extremely large undertaking. But in 1984, the gallery shifted. It became increasingly professional. And part of this was bringing on an independent director and one who was not an employee of External Affairs, but one who had a really deep expertise in contemporary art. And so this first director in this period from 1984 to 98 was Prof Morin, who really made strides in terms of connecting with the New York community and doing incredible collaborations with different artists in the United States, as well as different arts organizations. So this was a very important period in the gallery. And then the third and final period, starting in 1989, we see 49th Parallel shift again. And what the gallery does is it engages in a public-private partnership with the Professional Art Dealers Association of Canada, or PADAC. So again, this is a real reorientation of the gallery's programming. And so what they do is they become a satellite of sorts for private galleries in Canada to send programming to New York. So this kind of gives you a sense of, the breadth of 49th Parallel's activities, as well as three different directions that they took. But I wanted just to kind of make reference to what's been going on more recently in cultural diplomacy in Canada. So shortly after we all gathered in Los Angeles to take part in the conference that started these book contributions, the Standing Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Trade opened up a study into arts and culture and how they're being used in Canada's foreign policy. So really interrogating what it means to have this as a third pillar. And this resulted in the 2019 report that you can see here on the screen, Cultural Diplomacy at the Front Stage of Canada's Foreign Policy. So in this period that I was thinking about 49th Parallel, which is, of course, had long ended, this is a historic case study. It seemed to be really an opening up of the space for considering the possibilities of Canadian cultural diplomacy. And so in this chapter, at the end of the chapter, I'm able to get into that a bit because 49th Parallel is often discussed as a history of, say, failure because of the gallery's closure. And it's often also discussed in terms of a lot of controversy which erupted around it that really had to do with the expense or the perceived expense of arts funding abroad. So in my chapter, I try to push back on that a bit and reframe the history of 49th Parallel, because I think that it's 11 years in New York City really speaks to to the success of this experiment for external affairs. And I think 49th Parallel offers a history of innovation and certainly an instructive example from which we could consider maybe new avenues for cultural diplomacy in Canada going forward. So I just want to show one more slide where I was thinking a bit about lessons from 49th Parallel. So why I think about 49th Parallel now, I think what we can garner from this example is an emphasis on innovation. So this idea of trying new approaches, experimenting, pivoting, and embracing flexibility. So this really speaks to the potential of approaching cultural diplomacy in new ways. I think connections is the second lesson that we can draw from 49th Parallel. Though 49th Parallel was targeting a really specific professional arts sector, this was also an international sector. So I think one lesson that might be drawn here is to look to build specific targeted opportunities for partnerships amongst professionals and specific communities. And then the final thing that's very thorny, of course, for any discussion of cultural diplomacy or public diplomacy for that matter, is this idea of metrics. So 49th Parallel, when it came under criticism, it often had to do with the fact that particular quantitative metrics or somewhat inappropriate metrics were applied to the center. So this is a lesson I think that it's important to take forward, that metrics can be qualitative as well as quantitative and should be calibrated and appropriate to an initiative's goals. So I'll leave it there, but I hope we can get into some of the details of 49th Parallel further in our subsequent discussion. Thanks so much.
And now, Mark.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you, Nick and Michael, and thank you for persevering with the publication. I'm delighted to join you and Sarah in this distinguished forum. My chapter relates to international contributions to Canada's 150th anniversary celebrations in 2017. I told that story as it relates to public diplomacy, closing with what seemed a particularly insightful gift exchange. The National Capital Commission in Ottawa has responsibilities that in Washington, D.C. are undertaken primarily by the National Capital Planning, the NCPC, and parts of the National Park Service. I served the commission for a decade as the executive responsible for national celebrations and commemorations, and then for a 5-year term as CEO. In 2011, I took a sabbatical to pursue research into city diplomacy, and it was truly a wonderful experience thanks to the Fulbright Commission and the Center on Public Diplomacy. An interest in city-to-city gifts prompted my contribution to this volume. And with the sesquicentennial approaching at that time, I'd worked with many stakeholders, including diplomatic missions, to plan projects that would leave a lasting legacy in the capital's landscape. One was with the US State Department. It was a partnership to rebuild what had once been a lovely avenue leading to Canada's Parliament. Since 9/11, the main facade of the US Embassy had been screened behind an immense concrete barrier. So we used cycling lanes to create the necessary setback, and it was possible to soften the views and reopen the formal entrance to the embassy. And it was really a much appreciated people-to-people gift from all you in the US. Another was the sesquicentennial tulip, which was developed with the Embassy of the Netherlands. Nearly 5 million bulbs of this tulip, which resembles the Canadian flag. I'll show you the box here, some pictures of it. These were about 5 million were distributed, including these boxes, which were presented to the diplomatic missions. A new exposition center was built in a heritage courtyard to host 10 embassy exhibitions through the year of 2017. It was inaugurated by the State Department. This passport was a takeaway from all of the pavilions. And another pavilion was the Global Center for Pluralism, which was a disused national museum that was splendidly restored in an ongoing partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation Canada. I'd like to show a 90-second video overview of the NCC's 150th anniversary projects. Okay.
Every day, we work to build an inspiring capital that is a source of pride for all Canadians.
Okay. Okay. Screen sharing, stop share. There we go. Whoa. So in that video, you got a bit of an overview of the projects that we undertook. One of the most successful, probably the most successful outdoor event was the 50-acre display of giant floral sculptures that attracted 1.3 million visitors. And that included an instance of horticultural diplomacy, a Chinese gift of 2 dragons vying for a pearl. Canadians adored those floral serpents almost as much as the famous pandas. Now, I find it fascinating that the pandas made it, the panda diplomacy made it on the cover of the book. And the cuddly bears made me wonder, 150 years from a Chinese perspective, that's not much. Pandas have been effective diplomats since the Tang dynasty, preceding Canada's emergence as a nation by more than 1,000 years. It's as if they're saying, don't underestimate our longue durée. And it reminds us how the earliest intimations of public diplomacy extend back to prehistoric gift exchanges between clans and leaders. Marcel Maus's 1925 Essai sur le don sets forth the ancient obligation to give, receive, and reciprocate. He draws from the poetic Edda notions of parity, reciprocity, the animism of gift objects, and calls on honor, whose extreme case is the potlatch. As the scale of international gifts magnified to the point where scholars considered the Marshall Plan and international development aid in the gift discussion, we find an attendant bureaucratization, and indeed most states set very low thresholds for the acceptance of gifts. As such, most gifts exchanged between leaders, in fact, devolve to the realm of public diplomacy. De facto, they become people-to-people gifts, not personal exchanges. And yet, modern bureaucratic rationality never fully subjugates archaic gift exchange. The gift object remains vested with its own inscrutable properties, by times altruistic or devious. My chapter closes with Albie Sachs' 2016 Aga Khan lecture, and near the end of that talk, the eminent jurist stated his intention to present a gift to the Aga Khan, who was seated in the front row. While the gift was brought up, Sachs acknowledged a dilemma. Houston, I had a problem. Let me tell you the education I underwent in resolving that problem. The previous night, he'd worried, I don't like titles. South Africa's constitutional court had dispensed with honorifics. He found it difficult to use the appropriate form of address to the person to whom I want to hand the most precious product of South Africa, not gold, not diamonds, not even platinum, our Bill of Rights. He'd fretted since breakfast. Come on, Albie, he told himself, it's protocol, it's good manners, do it. And here he was in Toronto's splendid Aga Khan Museum, in his house. What gracious guest would not accept his title? Then, he said, the way discoveries are made. Just suddenly, of course. I'm not giving this document to a titled individual. I'm giving the document to the head of an extraordinary community with a long, long history. And through that person, I'm linking up with the community and the deeds that are being done in the name of that community. And that is something very beautiful. Here, the presentation of the gift opened up a space wherein incommensurable cultural practices were bracketed off. In that instance, diplomacy and public diplomacy merged. The leaders encountered each other, not just as individuals, but as representatives of entire social formations and histories. I'm overcoming my egalitarianism, not because I'm forced to, Sachs continued. It's actually rather lovely that I am, as it were, leaping out of my particular circumscribed worldview, which I'll defend if compelled. He met the Aga Khan in the aisle where they jointly held the unfurled Bill of Rights. I'm going to say with joy, Your Highness, please accept South Africa's most precious gift. Here, the diplomatic gift manifested a potential to open up a space of equivalence in asymmetrical power relations. It focalized entire donor and recipient societies through the personal interaction of the leaders. And this is what he found rather lovely, the alignment of the personal and collective through the ritual of the gift, an alignment that seems to exemplify the essence of public diplomacy. I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
What I want to do now is to call on the panelists to respond to what they think Canadian public diplomacy can do to meet the challenges of our moment. And in some ways, the indicators for Canada are good. Canada is doing very well in the Nation Brands Index, for example. Canadian people are thought to be or show up in that survey as the most admired people in the world, the people most liked. And the Canadian governmental system is the most admired governmental system at a time when the US system ranks 18th in perceptions around the world. But there are these good indicators for Canada, and yet we know that a reputation rests on delivery over time. What can Canada do to maintain a good reputation, and where do you see points of danger in Canada's reputation? Let me just throw those out there.
First of all, I think we have to situate the context that we're currently in. And frankly, for me, I think it's discouraging. A whole series of trends that we've been witnessing for the past decade or more have been accelerated by the pandemic. Some of them relatively benign, like online shopping and distance education, and others more concerning, like the social isolationism that's driven by an increasing commitment to social media, mental health issues, and other domestic problems, and some much more concerning the increase in political polarization, the rise in nationalism, the rise in isolationism, the rise in otherism. All of that is important because I think the need for greater soft power tools, more nuance, and a greater commitment is absolute. And while I agree with Nick that Canada enjoys a good reputation, maybe even a great reputation, that could change very quickly. I think we need to do three things, and I think this is well documented in the recent literature. I think we need to understand that we need to recreate the balance between digital and physical. I think we need to manage the change that's taking place. Some of my friends and colleagues in Ottawa talk about how cost-effective it is to use Zoom and other digital platforms. And there's a bit of a danger of us going too far in that direction. In-person, in-place activities, in my view, are critical. And again, I worry about that balance being disrupted. I think we also have to look at the global local balance. Canada has always had a focus on its position in the world. I think we need to think about different parts of Canada and their position in the world. And along the lines of Mark's presentation, I think we need to pay more attention to cities, what they do, how they handle it, what their role might be. And then finally, and this is, I've been making this argument with my colleagues and friends in the Canadian government for well over a decade, they need to actually spend more money and build capacity. We need to train diplomats in the new skills they need, again, balancing the digital, the social, the in-person, and the practical. That's a very high-level answer.
I think you're correct to direct attention to Canadian cities, because that seems to be one of the elements that we can see in the data is undersold. People, if you ask a typical person around the world, what do they think of when they think of Canada? All the answers are mountains, forests are natural. The cities don't come to mind and seem to be very definitely underleveraged. But let's go to Sarah.
I mean, I think Michael did such a great job of outlining the many big picture issues that everyone, I mean, globally is grappling with, but especially in Canada. For me, when I think about what can public diplomacy do to meet the current moment, of course, I'm thinking about Canada and how it's grappling with the legacies of colonialism. And, you know, this summer has been so many difficult revelations across Canada in terms of those discoveries. And I think perhaps what Canada can do is kind of bravely, boldly meet that and open up really frank and difficult discussions that might then in turn allow Canadians to connect with other communities and countries who are also facing similar issues with legacies of colonialism. And of course, the other thing that comes to mind when thinking about our current moment is to the issues of inequality within Canadian society that have been perhaps laid a bit more bare because of the pandemic. I mean, there's been so many devastating impacts. And while I don't think we should only be focusing on artists, I did want to make the point, especially because my research focuses on cultural workers and cultural institutions, that these have been devastating impacts on artists and cultural producers in Canada, as well as cultural institutions. So I think it would be important to really think about cultural diplomacy's real ability to forge connections. And yes, that requires significant investment. And I think that's investment that the government has again and again hinted at its interest in, and as Michael says, hasn't fully been realized. We need to pay attention to cultural producers because they have strong global networks and they have vibrant practices that I think, you know, Canada could be in danger of losing. So I wanted to put that to the floor.
Mark, what do you see as the priorities?
Emphasizing tangible culture over virtual or online culture, I think is a good idea. And I think objects have a great force that you lose online. I also like the idea of revived cultural diplomacy. I'm glad about the Senate report. A Senate report is not the most powerful document in Ottawa, but it's something. It's interesting that an academic conference may be outdated quickly, but a Senate report can be outdated quickly too. And when you look at the interveners on the Senate report, and I know both you and Sarah were, they really came from the high culture sector primarily. It was very much a view of the cultural diplomacy of the old DFATE school that came out of it. And 49th Parallel was a great example of that. And in fact, I visited it in 1983 or 84 and had enjoyed the fact that it wasn't very governmental. I mean, you wouldn't have known that it was governmental when you went in. But I think that Senate report hasn't caught up with changes on the ground. And even in 2017, you know, 20% Canadian, there was a drop in 21% of Canadians favoring the 150th anniversary from the 125th anniversary in 1992. There was an uneasiness about identity and identity politics. There was a protest on Parliament Hill. A teepee was erected on Parliament Hill. It was a little bit like Invasion Day on Australia Day in Australia. So there were things moving, the Idle No More movement and so forth, which were interesting because my 5 years at the NCC were a constant deepening of engagement with the Algonquin First Nation, who are the hosts of the capital on their traditional territories. And in the video, you saw actually a pavilion that we opened, a park that we co-designed with them. There was tremendous momentum in bringing together these disparate leaders of the Algonquin community through that whole period. And yet there's a churn in the culture. And I think, you know, Michael's comments are right. In a way, it's discouraging. It's messy. But I think Sarah's right. There's an opportunity. There's an opportunity to rebrand around whatever comes out of this kind of difficult discussion that's going on, which has some elements that are very extreme. But these kind of discussions always do. And added with the COVID, you know, are we at a point of a historical break? I don't know. Some people, there was the conference on South Asian or an Asian diplomacy last week had a speaker that really felt the COVID is a historic break. We'll see. You never know you're in one when at the time. But I would say that Canada actually has an opportunity at the moment from all of these problems that have been raised to kind of lead the way into a really post-colonial state.
Oh, no, I would agree. And I think that if you think the problems of the 21st century are too big for any one country, it makes sense to look for leadership from a country that's used to collaborating and that has a collaborative mindset. This is no time for prima donnas. And I think it's a harder century to live in if you're the country that expects to deliver all the answers. So, I would go so far to say that Canada is better situated, than the United States. One thing that came out of what you were saying, Mark, is that I think that a lot of the processes around the National Capital Commission were about reminding the domestic audience of international connection. And this is something that's often neglected in public diplomacy studies, that we spend so much time talking about engaging foreign audiences, we forget about the importance of bringing a domestic audience along and sort of initiating them into a collaborative, exchange-focused mindset. We have a couple of questions have come in from the floor. Maybe Michael, are you aware, Michael, of actual things that the Foreign Affairs Canada has done, Global Affairs Canada has done to respond to the news of the schools and the mass graves at the schools?
I'm not sure global affairs specifically, but there are specific steps that the federal government has taken over the last few months, not least of which is the appointment of Mary Simon, an Indigenous person, as our new Governor General. Right. That is not insignificant. Secondly, the Prime Minister appointed 5 new senators, most notably my friend Michelle Odette, who was a commissioner in the Commission on the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, and was for years the national chair of the Indigenous Women's Association. And finally, and again, largely ceremonial, or in any event, September 30th is now a federal statutory holiday. It is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So the first steps have been public apologies, public recognition, public statements, appointment of persons who are occupying positions who will now be able to advance those causes from inside the room.
No, I think that's certainly a good start. Now, that was a question from Greta Morris. Second question from Greta is to Sarah, whether there are other centers like 49th Parallel have been tried elsewhere by Canada. And building on that, Sherry Mueller would like to know about metrics of 49th Parallel. What metrics have you used to positively assess its impact?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. In terms of other centers like 49th Parallel was a one-off. It was not an experiment repeated elsewhere by Global Affairs Canada. But what I did find interesting in the research is in the early 80s when it was opening in New York, so 81, 82, there's reports that other countries were looking closely at the model. So it did generate a significant amount of media coverage, not just amongst the arts community who were very interested in the offerings, but also amongst other diplomatic practitioners who were interested in 49th Parallel as a model. So Australians, for instance, were interested and visited 49th Parallel to see how this more kind of subtle way of connecting artists in different communities would work. So I'm not sure what that may have resulted in elsewhere, but I did find that an interesting finding. In terms of the metrics, 49th Parallel had several kind of public controversies during its 11-year run. And one of the most prominent was in 1985. So kind of partway through, after it had been up and running for a few years, it was under the direction of France Morin. And there was a report that was commissioned by Global Affairs into its cultural centers. It was called the Woods-Gordon Report, and it was a scathing report of Canadian cultural centers abroad. And what happened is that 49th Parallel, which had this quite unique model, was lumped in with the Canadian Cultural Center in London and Paris, and at that point there was a cultural center in Brussels. So these are kind of more formal diplomatic spaces that were showing very different types of art. And the Woods-Gordon metric was pretty much, it recommended the closure of 49th Parallel. It did not find it as selling Canada enough. And so I think the problem with metrics looking at overt nationalism, metrics looking at a lot of quantitative data that maybe didn't perhaps take into account the context, right? So if you're thinking about evaluating a gallery like 49th Parallel on the fact that it could, sell millions of dollars worth of art, but you don't take into effect the idea that 49th Parallel didn't have a stable roster of artists, or they actually couldn't legally sell works on the premises, so it was really hard to quantify what got sold. It just, I think it was a unique, incredibly kind of complicated pilot project, and it ran into trouble when they tried to apply metrics that might have been appropriate for perhaps other cultural centers or museums and galleries.
It was interesting that it had that phase where it was doing artistic collaborations.
Yes, and I think that is a metric for success. So
Right.
where it was successful, as you could see, it made absolute inroads into New York's cultural scene, which is, a leading global leader in terms of contemporary art. So the gallery was working with other private galleries to put shows on that were reviewed in Art Forum and Arts in America. So kind of leading cultural arts publications were recognizing the offerings of this venue. It wasn't just kind of checking a box in terms of showing a Canadian artist. It was kind of sparking new conversations. And some of the most exciting things that 49th Parallel did were collaborations with other galleries and artists. And it also really helped to build networks for Canadian artists and gallerists in New York. And this was actually tangible when these controversies happened, because when the controversies happened, leading cultural producers and cultural experts in the United States stood up to defend 49th Parallel, which I think certainly speaks very highly of its offerings.
Yeah, that's a metric in its own right. Another question from Sherry Mueller, this time for Mark, and that's, have you got some examples of really creative gifts exchanged?
Well, one of my favorite Canadian gifts was a playbill that was found in the National Archives, in our Library and Archives Canada, by a researcher that proves to be the oldest printed document in Australia. And it was given by the foreign minister at the time, I think it was Shelley Glover, to Australia. And it is kind of a foundational document. And it was just discovered by a researcher and who put it two and two together, that this was the oldest gift. But the gifts are it's a strange topic when you get into it. They're full of oddities. There was an artist made quite a beautiful sculpture for Charles de Gaulle for his famous aborted trip to Canada, where he said "Vive Québec libre" from the balcony of the Montreal City Hall, and he never made it to Ottawa. That was the end of the journey. So the gift was never given, and it was recent. Well, I think before the COVID, it was put on display in the Museum of History, and it had been in the vaults for all those decades. So there's so many gifts, and there are inalienable gifts of music, gifts of living cultural treasures who animate, the Norman Bethune in China and others would be a great example. I could go on all day about the craziness of the gifts that leaders give, but if you're given a USB gift pen, make sure it doesn't have spyware on it. But I wanted to go. These are great questions, by the way, that are coming in on the chat, and I just wanted to go back and point out something interesting about capital cities, have diplomatic communities. Therefore, public diplomacy happens in a different way in capital cities. And I think, Nick, that's something that could be used more. I used to address all the incoming diplomats twice a year about Canada and about the capital and so forth. And it's just the tip of an iceberg of a huge cluster of activity that doesn't happen in other kinds of cities. But there's another kind of nation-to-nation public diplomacy that we have to recognize, and that is that First Nations we are in the federal government of Canada. We were, on a track to deal nation to nation, and that's how we would deal, and including the exchange of gifts, including rethinking how these discussions work. And yet the Truth and Reconciliation report has an action item that every Indigenous person has the right to a nationality. And there's an ambivalence, an ambiguity in this question of nationality that I think this is one of the things to work out in Canadian public diplomacy that could be very exciting. And having had many of these discussions, and actually across the country with Indigenous leaders, immediately if you start with a gift of tobacco or whatever is appropriate protocol in the circumstance, and you ask for permission to go in the territory, right away you're into a different discussion. And this is where we have to go without losing sight of a kind of collective vision as well. So I think that is really interesting. I think in terms of what can be done with Washington and the embassy in Washington, I mean, I visited the National Capital Planning Commission probably 15 times over my career in the NCC, including giving a lecture on Canada's capital. And they came to Ottawa, and it was a rich exchange, the core of an international capital cities network. So anything that the embassy can do to nurture that relationship is very good, because there are homologies between our capitals that go very deep.
And we have another question from Bruce Gregory, who points out that Canada has a tradition of scholar practitioners, and he mentions Arthur Gottlieb, he mentions Daryl Copeland and Evan Potter. And I'm glad to say that Daryl and Evan both contributed to this book. So Bruce's question is, are there up-and-coming scholar practitioners that are doing interesting things to move forward the practice and the study of public diplomacy? And in some ways that's dealt with by Evan Potter's contribution to this book, which talks about Canada's digital diplomats. I should say the book retails for just $20 or thereabouts. So it's one of those where you really can read for yourselves, not like a $150 book where it's only for the library. But anybody on the panel aware of a particularly interesting practitioner, scholar that they'd like to flag?
First of all, I should point out that the Center for Intercultural Learning, which is the federal government's foreign training institute, has PD as part of every head of missions training. I know that for all persons, the ambassador and all heads of missions and consulates, I actually do the PD training myself. So I know they do that. The person I would point to is Ben Roswell. I don't know if I wouldn't call him up and coming. He's absolutely here. He has been a Canadian diplomat for about 15 years. More recently, he's heading up the Canadian International Council. He's very focused on digital diplomacy, very committed to cultural diplomacy, and there are a group around him. I'd also point to Laurie Peters, who, although just returned from being our ambassador to Jamaica, is back in the public diplomacy game and is pushing hard. She's switched jobs too, but Roxanne Dubé, our former Consul General in Miami, came back to Ottawa as the director of the Center for Intercultural Learning and put in place programs that very strongly encouraged public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy as part of the training process for young Canadian diplomats.
That's great. Now I have a question from Bill May, who's one of the pioneers of American online diplomacy. And he says, fully acknowledging the strength of in-person PD work hands-on, there is the reality of a population demographic for whom online is now the norm. Looking at lessons learned during COVID-19, during COVID-19, what initiatives are in the wings to leverage those tools and experiences to reach that demographic?
I think this online context is so important. And as much as we miss seeing each other and we bemoan the lack of connection, you're right. There is certainly, I think, a big thing is accessibility that's gained from online venues. But I also think that there were things happening online before that we perhaps didn't quite recognize. So one example that I want to bring up was thinking about the last Canadian exhibition at the Venice Biennale, which is, of course, the world gathering of artists in the different national pavilions. And Isuma, the Inuit Video Collective, was featured in 2019 at the Venice Biennale. And what is so fabulous about that is so much of their work is available anywhere online. And so it was deployed in Venice, but it was quite possible for people for whom travel to Venice was, cost prohibitive or simply not accessible to actually access those cultural goods online. So I think more and more we're seeing people pivot to hybrid events in the arts world. We're seeing increased attention to things like transcription, access, and I think that could be something that's so important for public diplomacy to kind of hold on to as we perhaps reemerge in the world in the coming months.
Those are terrific answers that really show the value of the Canadian example, because one of the problems in public diplomacy studies is it tends to be all USA all the time. And so I think your contributions today, the anthology as a whole, go to show that there's a lot to learn from the Canadian experience. And it really helps to have this kind of conversation. So again, I please take a look at the book, and thank you so much to the panelists today. Thank you to the audience and for the terrific questions. Now, our next meeting is a mid-month meeting taking place on the 18th, where the subject is going to be China and Chinese use of bots to amplify hostile voices in public diplomacy. So very a kind of a change of pace there. It's been a lot of fun. I put on my Make Canada Great Again t-shirt just for the occasion, and appreciate everybody joining in. So thanks ever so much.